Yeah, so I want to preface this by saying that obviously things are moving really quickly. A lot of the stuff that Trump is trying to do is being challenged, and also new things are being announced every day. So if you do have more updated information than I do in this talk, you're very welcome. So some of this might be a little bit outdated, but also, you know, it's good to talk about even just what Trump has been trying to do to get a sense of his overall project. And because we know that all of the different moves that Trump makes have the potential to shape the kind of political terrain that we're operating on. And one thing that I don't cover a lot in the talk that we can pick up in the discussion is like, what are the impacts going to be for us here and internationally? So in some ways, Trump is in a stronger position now than he was during his last term. So Trumpism is more widely accepted, embraced by the political right. Trump now has a loyal cabinet, a solid right-wing majority on the Supreme Court, who have been showing that they're very willing to overturn precedent and to rule in favour of the sort of reactionary right-wing project, as we saw with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, for example. Nonetheless, there is grounds for hope, or at least grounds against despair, which I'll try to sort of finish the talk on. Broadly speaking, we know a lot about Trump's political project thanks to Project 2025. So this political initiative was published last year in April by the think tank Heritage Foundation, the sort of far-right think tank, in preparation for Trump's victory. And they have described it as institutionalizing Trumpism. So it's all about consolidating power in the executive branch, that is the branch of the government that's controlled by the president, and expanding the president's control over the executive branch. It involves purging the public service of people who aren't loyal to Trump, dismantling certain government agencies. They want tax cuts for capitalists, cutting Medicaid and Medicare, reducing environmental regulations, removing legal protections for LGBTQ people, removing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And they want the DOJ to be prosecuting anti-white racism instead. The project recommends mass arrest, deportation, and detention of migrants, and they want to be able to deploy the military for domestic law enforcement. And they want to enact various laws championed by the Christian right, including criminalizing people who send or receive abortion and birth control. So Trump and his handlers are moving very quickly on this project. So they know that if they go on the offensive and they unleash a barrage of assaults, then they have the potential to overwhelm and demobilize opposition. And create sort of confusion that can then lead to sort of preemptive compliance with these things. And secondly, because they know that their grip on power is actually quite tenuous when it comes to public support, and they'll be wanting to push as much of this through as possible before the midterms. So let's have a look at how this project is playing out so far. All right, so Trump is making good on the plan to consolidate power within himself and within the executive branch. So he's pursuing a range of different policies to purge the public service and federal agencies, from invoking Schedule F to reclassify public servants as political appointees, to making illegal buyout offers for federal employees. So most of these are facing some kind of legal challenge, including from unions. Nonetheless, hundreds of thousands of jobs are currently on the line, and many cuts have already been made. Trump is trying to seize control of government spending and to freeze spending for various government departments and agencies, notably foreign aid was his first salvo into this. There's been a confusing sort of back and forth of legal challenges to this, leaving important public services and agencies uncertain about the state of their funding, the status. There was a legal challenge that halted Trump's order to freeze foreign aid, which was upheld by the Supreme Court. So they ruled against Trump in this instance. However, it was a 5-4 decision, meaning that still nearly half of the justices were publicly backing Trump's ability to unilaterally just shutter a government department. There has been protest against this, including from the Democrats, but the initial response was quite mixed. So former White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel said of it, well, whenever you talk about cuts, the first thing people mention is foreign aid. You don't fight every fight. You don't swing at every pitch. And my view is that while I care about US aid, that is not the hill that I'm going to die on. Completely missing the point of what's happening here. Trump now has Department of Education in his sights. So Trump's plans, I think it's important they reveal the political nature of fights over budgets and spending. So it's not about frugality or waste, it's about control. Funding is one of the main ways that a government can control what does or does not happen by funding agencies they want to promote, defunding agencies that they disapprove of, or making funding conditional on agencies complying with a particular political agenda. Broadly, Trump is trying to wrest control off Congress, with spending traditionally being one of the main ways they had power. And more specifically, he's using funding to try to push this conservative political agenda. The latest on this is that we may end up with a government shutdown, which is what happens when Congress refuses to endorse federal budget. And there are back and forth negotiations happening between the Republicans and the Democrats about this at this point. The Department of Government Efficiency, headed by Elon Musk, is part of this project of power consolidation. It's not actually a department, it's an advisory body which agency heads are being ordered to comply with, to cooperate with them to review and justify spending, to identify contracts to terminate or alter in order to be in line with Trump's policy agenda. And this includes a big purge of DEI, which I'll talk a bit more about later. They are also charged with overseeing new tech infrastructure. The legality of DOGE itself and of Musk's authority to lead it is questionable and is being challenged. One big area of concern is the access that Musk and his people are being given to the sort of behind-the-scenes digital infrastructure of the US payment system. All right, so much for the governmental power grab. Trump is also trying to find ways to exert more control over the US population. So one of the main ways that he's doing this is through immigration policies. So Trump has issued an executive order revoking birthright citizenship. So if you are born in the US, to people who aren't US citizens, you are a citizen, but he wants to revoke that, which goes very blatantly against the Constitution and will likely end up at the Supreme Court. Trump has announced a goal of millions of deportations. He's issued targets to ICE and is trying to expand the liberties that they can take, such as conducting raids in sensitive locations like churches, schools, and hospitals, although this has been opposed. He is also okayed proxy arrests, which is when ICE targets a specific individual to be arrested. They can then just bring in anyone else who happens to be nearby, who they think is sort of giving off immigrant vibes. Once someone is detained, it's then on that person to prove that they are a US citizen, which is, actually quite difficult and in some cases impossible to do. And obviously, this would be bad even if it was just targeting undocumented migrants, but US citizens, including Native Americans, have already been impacted by this. And the wider impact, of course, is just normalizing an expanded presence of law enforcement on the streets with extended abilities to sort of infringe on people's freedoms. Trump has threatened to house 30,000 deportees in Guantanamo Bay. This plan is meeting with a lot of legal, logistical, financial hurdles, which is not necessarily good news for deportees because it could just end up with them housed in subpar conditions or just housed elsewhere. It's also through immigration law that Trump is trying to achieve that stated Project 2025 goal of being able to use the military for domestic law enforcement. So he is trying to use the supposed threat posed by migrants to invoke the Insurrection Act, which is something that could mean that he can use the military on US soil, initially to police the border, but from there, who knows. And Trump has previously said that he would have liked to use the military against Black Lives Matter protests. Trump is also using anti-immigration as one way to crack down on pro-Palestinian protesters. So he wants to revoke student visas for pro-Palestinian, or as he calls them, pro-Hamas protesters. The latest on this is that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is launching a program that uses AI to monitor student social media accounts. Yeah, I'm sorry that this is just a barrage of horrible things. Okay. So on sort of attacks on workers and oppressed people, so Trump's policy agenda involves a variety of different attacks along these lines, as well as the attacks on migrants, obviously. So federal agencies, schools, public services, and even businesses are being asked to drop DEI initiatives and to provide proof that they are not taking part in DEI, they're not using DEI policies, under threat of funding cuts or of prosecution for discrimination. Agencies are being told to remove all references to certain words or phrases, to remove any contract or job that is related to DEI measures. This has caused a lot of confusion among people about what they are now allowed to do, their job status, and obviously it's having a huge chilling effect. There are challenges, so schools and educational institutions, for example, are pushing back. I know a group of them have launched a legal challenge, but others are also preemptively complying, including dozens of big companies have already dropped or pared back their DEI policies. There's more that I could say on that, but I'll just leave that for now. One example of what's happening here, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, which processes claims about workplace discrimination, has been ordered to not process claims relating to discrimination against LGBTQ people. And Trump has, of course, also made attacks on trans people. Here's the little summary of what's happening with DEI that we have covered. Yep, here's a list of some companies that have already removed or scaled back DEI policies. We've got Uber, Pepsi, Google, Target, Meta, Amazon, Lowe's, and McDonald's. All right, and then on to attacks on transgender people in particular. So, in line with Project 2025, Trump has issued executive orders attempting to block access to gender-affirming healthcare for people under 19, banning trans women and girls from sports, ordering the Ministry of Defence to ban trans people in the military, announcing that the federal government will only recognise two sexes, fixed, quote, at conception, and commanding federal agencies to remove all mention of gender identity and to stop funding any project recognising it. Trump's government has also stopped issuing accurate passports and documentation to trans people and has begun a campaign to monitor and influence the curriculum, and has erased important information, so historical records, medical data, and research from federal government websites. So 10 lawsuits have been taken up against the Trump administration's anti-trans policies. At my last check, 4 of those have resulted in temporary restraining orders that pause the enforcement. But these policies have already begun to affect people's lives. So, for example, I read that hospitals in blue states like Massachusetts and New York did stop providing care to trans adolescents and young adults following the executive order, and I'm not sure if all of them have sort of restarted again since. Once again, along with the immediate impacts of all of this, we have to contend with the broader chilling effect that they entail. So The Guardian reported that Pride Toronto in Canada has lost corporate funding as 3 sponsors who also do business in the US have pulled out to avoid being seen as supporting LGBT rights. Okay, so that's on the domestic level. To look at the international situation and the extent to which Trump is sort of shaking things up in that terrain. So if I was to try to, sort of briefly describe the global order as it has stood in recent years, it would be with the US sort of waning in power, but still very much at the top of an imperialist pecking order. And maintaining this position has meant, in part, maintaining the stability of the order, and negotiating with other imperialist powers, especially those in their own bloc, in order to achieve this. And it's also meant finding ways to confront and to head off emerging imperialist rivals in China and Russia. Trump is now pushing an America First policy, which seems to present a real possibility of destabilizing existing imperial relationships. So obviously, as workers, as students, we have no stake in the comparatively stable imperialist order that predated this. And we know that the so-called rules-based international order is a joke because we've seen the impunity with which Israel has acted in attacking Palestine, Gaza, other places in the region, violating international law countless times. However, it's also workers and the oppressed who would stand to suffer with any sort of increasing volatility and instability in these relations as well. There are different schools of thought interpreting Trump's actions on this. So some are taking the America First slogan quite literally, emphasizing his shift towards sort of what seems like opportunism and sort of unilateral aggression. He certainly does not seem to care about alienating allies, as can be seen with his revoking aid and his imposition of tariffs and things like that. Others, such as US socialist David McNally, and thanks for pointing me in this direction, Grant, caution against seeing Trump purely as a rogue agent or as a complete departure from previous policy, because for decades now the US has had a focus on a pivot to Asia. So trying to expand their power in Asia and the Pacific to try to contain China as their main rival. And in this light, you could see Trump's cozying up to Putin as a sort of strategic alliance in order to head off the main enemy of the moment in China. So despite, legal challenges, diplomatic backlash and resistance from some US companies, chaos in the stock market, Trump seems determined to go ahead with big tariffs in Mexico, China, and Canada. He's pushing a sort of expansionist agenda, so he's repeatedly threatened to annex Greenland in order to block Russia and China and control crucial shipping routes and natural resources. Trump has also announced that he would like to take back the Panama Canal, again seeking to head off Chinese influence over that sort of important route. And in both cases, Trump has not ruled out military action to bring about his desired ends in his rhetoric. With Ukraine, so since the election, we've seen Trump exclude Ukraine from peace talks. We've seen him publicly hector and belittle Ukrainian leader Zelensky, all attempts to undermine Ukraine's self-determination and to force them into making concessions to Russia. All of this while Trump cuts off aid to Ukraine and plans to cancel legal status for 240,000 Ukrainians who fled the war to the US. And then there is Gaza. So since early February, Trump has been talking about plans to take over and own Gaza, displacing the millions who already live there. Trump talks about this plan as if it were a property development scheme, and he's even created this nightmarish AI-generated video showing Trump Gaza as a luxury retreat for the wealthy. As human rights groups and the UN-head Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territories points out, what this actually amounts to is, of course, ethnic cleansing, which would entail further atrocities, war crimes, crimes against humanity, on top of what has already been, to quote Human Rights Watch, a calculated Israeli policy to make parts of the Strip unlivable. So even if this plan was a pipe dream, and there are various sort of logistical reasons why it would be very difficult to realize this, it's already provoked backlash from neighboring countries, from Jordan and Egypt, as you would expect, and it's escalated tensions between Israel and neighboring states. And it's feeding the most sort of reactionary, genocidal elements in Israeli society by legitimating their desire to ethnically cleanse Gaza. Okay. All right, so how do we get here? So I think what I would like to do is to take a step back and kind of look at the situation globally, because the rise of the far right is not something that is just unique to the US. something that people have been examining for quite a long time now, and there are people like the UK socialist David Renton, for example, who've been doing work on what he calls the new authoritarians, and other, pieces of writing that have come out recently as well. I haven't read Disaster Nationalism, but if you have, weigh in. So some trends that I have sort of pulled out from my reading on this is that there is a protracted economic and social crisis. Obviously, this is exacerbated by COVID and ecological disasters, which has led to a crisis in legitimacy for mainstream political parties who have overseen austerity. And we have the rise of the far right and far-right reaction in this context without a corresponding growth in the far left. There's been changes in the composition of the far right, with new currents, new groups emerging and interacting with more traditional forms. And there's been an increasing willingness of traditional right-wing parties to entertain the more radical fringe. So we've also seen liberal left parties tack right, and centrist parties tacking right, and sort of sidelining left-wing elements within their own parties and coalitions. And we're seeing some things like the base of the far right continuing to be among, petty bourgeoisie, small business owners, people who have been hit by these crises particularly hard, B-class sections of the working class and the poor, and particular sections of the hyper-wealthy. So we've seen Trump really courting the tech billionaires, for example. And obviously there's been far-right ideology and rhetoric that goes along with all of this. So scapegoating marginalised and oppressed groups, particularly migrants, trans people, evoking hyper-nationalism, talking about, sort of traditional values and sort of mythological pasts, and the use of online cultures to target young men for radicalisation. So I think we can already see a lot of this stuff playing out in the US from what we've talked about already. I'll touch on a few sort of specific points in more detail. So, crisis. And I think this is sort of one of the main words that occurs to me thinking about this whole situation is crisis. So like the capitalist class globally, US capitalists are facing a long-term decline in the rate of profitability as the economy comes up against its ecological limits. Where normal approaches fail, increasingly extreme measures are pursued to try to restore profitability. For the US population, inflation and the cost of living have been on the rise since that global trend started in 2021. It's currently at around 3%, the last that I saw. The cost of transport, medicine, groceries, clothing and other basics are continuing to climb in the US. Eggs, famously, have risen more than 15% amid shortages caused by outbreak of avian flu. And wealth inequality is higher in the US than in almost any other developed country and has been on the rise for most of the past 60 years. So upper income families were the only ones to increase their share of wealth between 2001 and 2016. And then in more recent years, though there has been a small percentage increase in wealth for lower income households, partly due to COVID relief measures, the wealth gap between rich and poor in total dollars has increased. As for what's happening on the right, so I think it's pretty clear from Project 2025 that the far right is now calling the shots within the Republican Party, escalating a long-term trend of the Republicans increasingly turning towards inflammatory sort of culture war politics. Since his emergence, Trump has encouraged and courted a wide array of right-wing currents, from the Christian right to the alt-right to the MAGA movement that he inspired himself. And he's not shied away from appealing to, sort of conspiracist, sort of nut job currents, or to street thugs like the Proud Boys and the militia movement. And he's even tried his hand at sort of trying to mobilize some of these weird fringe forces, as we saw on January 6th. He has now, since becoming president, pardoned everyone who took part in January 6th. All right, and then on the Democrats. So obviously there's plenty to criticize in the Democrats. They have pretty consistently failed to effectively oppose Trump, whether that's when they're in office or when they're in opposition. Their responses tended to be to rail against Trump as a fascist when they're in opposition, and then at all other times to treat him as a regular opponent and to turn a blind eye to the sort of gradual erosion of democratic norms. They've sought to neutralise left-wing challenges, so they sort of sidelined Bernie Sanders back in 2016 and now have essentially just sort of absorbed him back into the Democratic mainstream. And while Biden tried to style himself as Union Joe and did make some efforts to introduce pro-worker reforms, these tended to dry up by the end of his second term. So as US socialist Ashley Smith writes for Tempest, his industrial policy was modest, and his social reforms died in Congress. He was unable to renew anti-poverty measures and thus oversaw austerity while inflation drove up the cost of everything from groceries to housing. And the Democrats tacked right on some key issues, namely immigration. So while the Biden campaigned on reversing Trump's draconian policies, by 2024, Biden and Harris were officially endorsing a sort of Trumpian immigration plan, which was cooked up by the Republicans that would enshrine in federal legislation this idea of the border invasion that is now so central to Trump's narrative. Harris then campaigned on passing this bill, championing it as her own. And this is something that we've seen again and again with Liberal parties, where they have thrown migrants under the bus, thinking that they can score points off the right, only to find that, surprise, surprise, the right can do that better than they can. And now they've just contributed to normalising that bigotry that the right is feeding off. Okay, so I want to avoid trying to play the pundit and analyse the election results in too much detail as if I, have a lot of expertise in breaking down demographic information and things like that. And I'm also I'm not the Democrats' campaign strategist. So I'm not that interested in trying to kind of identify specific missteps that they've made that may have cost them votes here or there. That's why I'm more interested in these sort of broader trends. But to talk about the election a little bit, we are seeing this as a Democratic loss. It does feel significant that for the first time in decades, Democrats fared better with the richest Americans than with the poorest. The record donations that the Democrats received from the wealthy also feel significant, and the fact that didn't actually help them to win. The flip side of this, of course, reckoning with the fact that there were working class and poor voters who went for Trump, either in support of his bigotry or in willingness to sort of overlook it. However, I do take some encouragement from the fact that there's evidence that Trump's popular support, even at the time of the election, is really not strong. So Trump won 49.9% of the popular vote to Harris's 48.3%, which is a historically quite slim margin. While voter turnout was high by US standards, only 31% of eligible voters actually voted for Trump. About 30% of eligible voters went to Harris. Another 36% of eligible voters didn't vote. Another chunk of the adult population, of course, are not eligible to vote for various reasons. I think that it is significant that one particular demographic voted against Trump, voted for Harris in quite strong numbers by a 16-point margin, and that group is union members. Voter turnout among union members also increased compared to previous years. In some ways, this touches on a frustration for us because unions in the US have focused pretty exclusively on campaigning for the Democrats rather than organising sort of grassroots opposition. But at the same time, I think we possibly can see something hopeful here as well, because it's not the socialist argument that workers can never be racist, but it's when workers are organised and thinking as workers, there is more resistance to sort of bigotry, anti-trans prejudice and things like that. So if we're seeing this as class consciousness, helping to immunise people against Trumpism, in that light, you could see it as a positive thing. All right, so where to from here? I think another important socialist principle to hold on to at these times is that things can change and consciousness can change very quickly. So even sections of the US population, even the working class who perhaps have been captured by Trump, who have been demobilized and sort of completely frozen in this political moment, aren't lost to the politics of despair forever. What are the things that sort of augur best for a fight back at the current time? Firstly, again, Trump's very low support ratings. So his approval ratings were very low for a newly elected president, and they're dropping. So most recently, they were as low as 44%. Approval of his handling of the cost of living is already as low as 31%. So this is all extremely low for a recently elected president. Another is the instability of Trump's political coalition. So that eclectic assortment of right-wing forces, tech billionaires, aggrieved middle classes, and sections of the poor, this is not a stable coalition that share political goals and interests. And there is already infighting breaking out, for example, between the MAGA wing and the tech billionaires. Then there's the paper-thin sort of nature of Trump's political program. So he doesn't have any actual solutions to the problems that American people are facing. And in some instances, his policies are actually going to exacerbate them, which is going to lead to further discontent and potentially to fight back. Another thing that could help to provoke this backlash is the fact that he is having to push through all of these policies so quickly. And all of this taken together suggests that if the fight back that is already starting to build to Trump can be expanded and built upon and turned into mass resistance from below, then our side has a pretty decent chance of toppling the Trump regime. As for what this all means for socialism, I think at this point the argument to be made is mainly a negative one. And sort of like this is what happens in the absence of strong socialist politics and a strong left-wing alternative to right-wing politics. This is what happens without political currents that are focused on building power and resistance on the ground, and particularly centred around the working class, rather than focusing purely on electoralism. And finally, these are the crises that capitalism creates. Trumpism is a morbid symptom. Trump is a product of the contradictions of capitalism. So it's by uprooting capitalism that we prevent these periodic turns to inhumanity. And if mass fight back to Trump does return, then we'll be able to make this case more positively.